Thank you very much, and also start with thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's very interesting to be here, my first time. And I understood my task here today to give you another case study of a divided society, Germany during the Cold War. And basically I had a choice between going into depth in one of the many issues that divided Germany and divided Germany's historical culture during the time of the Cold War, or to provide you with somewhat of an overview of those issues that were divisive. And as I was not sure how many experts of Germany would be in the room, I went for the overview in the hope that we can then go into depth in the discussion. And I shall also try and keep to 20 minutes. Right. Basically, I think the rivalry between the two German states during the period of the Cold War is absolutely vital to understanding also the development of their memory cultures, and this rivalry circled around particular themes which all of them had a historical component, so that conflict over history was right at the heart of the rivalry between the two Germanys. And I've listed what I think are the most important themes: fascism and anti-fascism, capitalism and anti-capitalism, Sovietization versus Americanization, the appropriation of German discourses of Heimat, which go back to the 19th century, questions surrounding heritage and identity, and economic identity, which is very strong in Germany. Harold James, many years ago, has written a brilliant little book on the importance of economic identity for German identity, and last but not least, European identity. Now, if we start with the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, it always positioned itself as the better Germany, and one of the key historical arguments it had for that positioning was that it was the anti-fascist Germany. Nowhere was that idea more present than in Buchenwald, the concentration camp, which is a good example of the way in which the communist regime tried to cement the notion of the anti-fascist Germany, the anti-fascist communist Germany. Every child in the GDR had to visit Buchenwald. It was a sort of key display of the GDR's anti-fascism, and it served a variety of different functions. One important one was the memory of the Buchenwald Oath, the oath of prisoners in Buchenwald from the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party to overcome the division of the German labor movement, which was seen as the source of the defeat against fascism in 1933. The communist resistance in the GDR was always seen as the most important resistance to the fascist regime, and other forms of resistance were sidelined, as was also the Holocaust. It was only very late in the day, during the 1980s, that the GDR began to remember the Holocaust a little bit more. Of course, in classical communist speak, fascism was directly related to capitalism. The old Dimitrov explanation of fascism remained pretty much the official communist explanation of fascism. And in the course of the GDR, anti-fascism acquired a kind of formulaic quality, in the sense that it became a kind of rhetorical strategy. Of course, with those in the GDR who were actually anti-fascists, it was also a lived experience. But as a kind of rhetoric of legitimation, it actually impacted very little on the everyday life of people in the GDR. It was the formulaic character of that attempt to come to terms with the past which rendered it largely ineffective for many East Germans. The second theme, Sovietization. Of course, the famous slogan in German, von der Sowjetunion lernen heißt Siegen lernen, the notion that you learn from the Soviet Union, and that would automatically mean that victory will be yours. It includes the adaptation of various Soviet practices, including leadership cult, 5-year plans, the Stakhanov movement. There's also a kind of everyday Sovietization in the GDR, which reflects very much on Soviet history as a model for the young GDR. The big taboo, the big elephant in the room in the GDR was the Red Army and the occupation of Germany, including the issues of mass rape at the end of the Second World War committed against German women. The issue of German unity was also one that was prominent in the historical discourse of the GDR. Initially, after the foundation of the two Germanys, the GDR's position always was that it was the main guarantor of German unity, that it wanted to maintain German unity, but only German socialist unity. But it put the main blame for the division of Germany on the door of West Germany, and in particular the West German Chancellor Adenauer, who was routinely referred to as Spalter in German, as the person who divided Germany. After a very brief interlude in the 1970s, where the GDR emphasized not so much German history but socialist internationalism, the GDR returned from the 1970s onwards, and very strongly in the 1980s, to an appropriation of the 19th century language of German Heimat, the notion that there is a kind of smaller, somehow regional attachment that people form, which sort of unites the various regional attachments to a national attachment. So the notion of the Heimat GDR, you see the little poster on the right hand there, unsere Heimat DDR, our Heimat GDR, and you see sort of the pioneers walking in the sort of park-like structure, but you see in the background also the new housing estate, which were the sort of pride and joy of the GDR, but also historical buildings like the church here, and of course the factory appropriate for a workers' and farmers' state. This notion of Heimat was combined in particular in the 1980s with the notion of heritage and tradition. The distinction that was made in the 1980s was between heritage and tradition. Heritage was what the GDR directly saw as standing in line for the creation of a socialist Germany. Tradition was everything else in the past. And this distinction between heritage and tradition allowed GDR historians and the public discourse in the GDR to rediscover a number of historical themes that had been up until the 1980s taboo in the GDR, including the history of Prussia, in particular Frederick II. Frederick II, the famous statue of Frederick II unter den Linden, the main street in the East German capital of East Berlin, that had been removed in the 1950s, actually returned to Unter den Linden in the 1980s. Bismarck was rediscovered with a major 2-volume biography of Bismarck by Ernst Engelberg, one of the leading GDR historians. The formerly German territories in the East became a topic again, which had been completely taboo before. Actually, Germans who had been born in Königsberg, in East Prussia, when they moved to the GDR, in their passport they were not born in Königsberg, they were born in Kaliningrad. So, but that again, there was a rediscovery of that history, and again bourgeois traditions, bourgeois history, the history of German bourgeoisie was also rediscovered. And there is an argument in the literature that actually that kind of rediscovery of German tradition also led to a kind of revival of an old German historical consciousness in the GDR, which directly led in 1990 to demands for reunification. As a debate to what extent that can be argued, but at least the kind of historical debates of the 1980s included large doses of national history, which inevitably the East Germans shared with the West Germans, so that in 1990, under conditions of an anti-communist revolution, the demands of reunification could be actualized. If we move to West Germany, sorry for the pace, if we move to West Germany, then after 1945, one of the most prominent historical discourses was one of seeing Germany as a victim of Hitler. So rather than the Germans seeing themselves as perpetrators, they emphasized that in some respects they had been the first victim of Hitler. And that victimhood was particularly actualized through the portrayal of the history of the Second World War. The suffering of the ordinary soldier, again very much portrayed as the victim of an ideology of National Socialism. Pictures such as this one here, where you see a sort of German prisoner of war and a Soviet soldier standing above him. The prisoners of war in the Soviet Union were, again, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that if today we see a kind of shaved head behind barbed wire, we immediately think of concentration camps and the Holocaust. Now, the picture of a shaved head behind barbed wire was very present in German society in the 1950s. But it immediately, Germans in the 1950s would think of the German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union, not of the concentration and annihilation camps under the National Socialists. The bombing war against Germany also was an important means of constructing Germany as a victim of the Second World War. And in some respects, in a way, the historical discourse on victimhood was accompanied by a focus on rebuilding Germany after the war under conditions of the long economic boom. And it produced famous statements such as the one by Franz Josef Strauss, one of the leaders of the Christian Social Union, who stated in the 1950s, a people who has achieved so much has the right not to be reminded of Hitler at every corner. Also an interesting statement. Then the economic identity, again the economic miracle in Germany, the notion wir sind wieder wer, we are again someone, we're again someone of importance. Again, this harked back to a number of historical debates, including a debate about the ideology of German labor, that somehow there was something in the history of German labor which explains the productivity of Germany from the 19th century to the present day. There is also the notion of made in Germany, initially of course something invented by the British to indicate in the 19th century that all of the stuff that came out of Germany was crap. But of course already by the late 19th century the Germans had turned this around and had made it a kind of sign of quality of German goods. German values, including historical values, were connected to German economic success and incidentally, of course, also sporting success. The World Championships of 1945, which Germany won against the odds, were very much part and parcel of that feeling of wir sind wieder wer. Change then in the 1960s and 1970s, perhaps symbolized above all by this image here, Willy Brandt kneeling in front of the memorial for the Warsaw Ghetto Rising, and it was sort of signaled a major break in the West German historical culture. It was hugely controversial. One half of Germany basically accused Brandt of betraying Germany through this gesture, hard to imagine today. Also, you have to remember that in the election campaign of 1969, the opposition referred to Brandt as Brandt alias Fram. Fram was the name he adopted, and the notion was again that Brandt, who had been in exile and returned to Germany in a Norwegian uniform as a Norwegian citizen, actually was a traitor to Germany in the Second World War. So you see how divided West German society in its historical culture was in the 1960s. But from the 1960s onwards, and really sort of reaping the results in the 1970s, and to a large extent really only in the 1980s, was this kind of famous process of Germans coming to terms with the National Socialist past, which of course has also been criticized, that the Germans always have to be best at everything, and again they are kind of best at being the kind of world champions of coming to terms with the past. But it was a very long path, a very long process of getting there, and it did, I think, it did signify a major break in West German historical culture. But it also, in a way, the 60s and 70s went hand in hand with rediscovering a variety of marginalized traditions in West Germany, including a rediscovery of the working class history, labor movement history, women's history, moving into gender history. So in some respects, the sort of still strongly nationalist historical culture in the 1950s and 1960s gave way to a more cosmopolitan historical culture, or at least the kind of historical culture that the Germans, or increasingly many Germans, stylized themselves as being a cosmopolitan culture, which was rooted in many respects in a desire of Germans to be good Germans for once. That also included the idea of Germans as model Europeans. There was a large-scale enthusiasm for Europe in the 1950s, especially amongst younger people, which did come out of the frustrations of the Second World War. And it largely ignored what Alan Millward has so brilliantly analyzed as the birth of the EU as the rescue of the European nation state. So that kind of dialectic between rescuing a very threatened nation state at the end of the Second World War, and Europe was completely ignored by that European movement of the 1950s. The fact that, of course, the European discourse in the 1950s in Germany at an official level might have kind of used historical arguments of building Europe, but was very much politically associated with the attempt to reintegrate Germany into the West after the Second World War. Europe, in fact, provided in Germany in the 1950s an important addition to Americanization because of the particular historical culture in Germany, which was heavily conservative, heavily kind of nationalist. Americanization was deeply problematical because the West, and in particular America, had been for so long from the late 19th century up until the 1940s identified precisely as the negative other of Germany, so that in a way the European discourse, which was also in German a discourse about the Abendland, which was a conservative notion of the kind of traditional Western, Southwestern Europe, deeply Catholic, deeply conservative in its ambitions. That discourse, that historical discourse on Europe, accompanying a discourse of Americanization, made that integration into the West all the more easy. The cosmopolitan discourse from the 1960s and 1970s onward adapted that kind of European discourse, which was older, and reshaped it in a kind of cosmopolitan image. The 1980s in West Germany were very much characterized by the victory of the CSU in the elections in 1982. You have the election poster here, Helmut Kohl becomes Chancellor. The slogan was ein neuer Anfang für unser Land, a new beginning for our country. Very much part of that rhetoric was doubting the legacy of the 1960s, whereas the previous social democratic government that had ruled between 1969 and 1982 had very much seen itself as being in a tradition of 1968. This new government was doubting that legacy. It was re-emphasizing traditional German values, or what it perceived as traditional German values, particularly connected to family and church, and it also introduced a different understanding of history. One of the closest advisors of Helmut Kohl in the 1980s was a German historian called Michael Stürmer, and he basically emphasized the need for an historical identity of Germany he saw it as one of the main threats that Germany had no strong historical identity. So rebuilding a stronger positive national identity, one that in a way was not exclusively focused on the negative identity of Hitler and the Holocaust, became a main ambition under the Kohl government, and as a result of that you had the huge historians controversy of the 1980s, the Historikerstreit, which in some respects on the surface level was about the singularity of the Holocaust, or at least that was what Jürgen Habermas in his initial article, which started off the historians controversy, accused conservative historians such as Ernst Nolte to relativize the singularity of the Holocaust, but at another level, and in terms of national identity at a far more important level, it was really about acquiring a functional history for a divided country. So, in terms of a conclusion, we could say that the memory cultures in West Germany for the German population proved to be far more convincing than in East Germany. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the 1960s and 1970s. I think these 2 decades that are sometimes in the literature being referred to as the second foundation of the Federal Republic made it possible to arrive at a more critical reflection of the historical, the national past of Germany, and that also made it more convincing for the majority of people in Germany. In particular, the successful coming to terms with the National Socialist past, but also, I think, not to underestimate the rebuilding of a strong economic identity still today. I think you can see this very prominently in the current economic crisis in Europe. The strength of the German economic identity plays a large part in its historical identity, but also the successful Americanization and Europeanization. So, a question that arises out of all of that: what impact does that memory culture deriving from the Cold War have on the memory culture of the reunified Germany? We obviously, 25 years ago that the Berlin Wall fell, but we obviously still have some difficulties in integrating the 2 memory cultures of West Germany and East Germany, producing ongoing misunderstandings between the West and the East. And on a different level, I think we could also ask the question, what kind of memory divided societies are producing, or also perhaps normatively should produce. And here I wanted to suggest, and that's where I would like to end, Chantal Mouffe, of course, some years ago has written an interesting little booklet which is almost a kind of Streitschrift, where she argues that cosmopolitan memory, which is precisely the memory that the kind of left liberal establishment in West Germany pinned its hopes on in the 1970s, that cosmopolitan memory was actually perhaps not the way to go, because Chantal Mouffe argues that cosmopolitan memory depoliticizes conflict. It actually does not allow for any kind of speaking of different memories attached to sometimes different interests. And obviously, no one wants to fall back on antagonistic forms of memory, which often end up in violence. And she proposes, and this has been taken up also by historians such as, and literary scholars such as Anna Bull and Hans-Bauge Hansen, she proposes a form of agonistic memory. So it very much is something that I think goes back to kind of conflict theory in sociology, and the argument that you need to find ways of productively producing conflict, because in a way only through those conflictual discourses can memories be successfully transformed into political agendas. And that's, I think, where I want to leave it. Thank you very much.